Now, for a local take on all of this, and a very exciting local take on this particular issue, we're now turning our conversation to Elisa Crespo, who is running to represent the Bronx, I believe the 15th district on the New York City Council. If she is elected, she will be the first trans person elected to political office in the nearly 400-year history of New York City. Currently, she is an education liaison in the Bronx Borough President's Office. Elisa, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Imara, for having me.
Thank you, and congratulations on the beginning of your race and your bid. I'm wondering, just before we kind of turn to issues that I know that are going to be near and dear to your heart because you're running to focus on a very specific area, I'm wondering if it occurred to you beforehand or if it shocked you when you learned that no other trans person had ever been elected to office in New York City since, the 1600s.
It is quite shocking, to be honest with you, that Minnesota and Virginia and Colorado have beat us to the punch in that sense. New York City is seen as this progressive beacon and this place that is accepting and diverse and inclusive. And for the most part it is, but in politics, up until relatively recently, our politics have been, more on the moderate side.
Yeah. What is the thing that made you decide to run? When you just said, you know what, I have to get in this race, and this is the reason why I have to get in this race. What was that moment for you? I think it's important for people to understand that if they have similar notions, similar feelings, these similar issues, that they should get involved. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So first of all, I strongly believe that those of us who have suffered the most and who have been oppressed and marginalized and who have been pushed to the outskirts of the outskirts are the ones who have the solutions and ultimately the ones who should be sitting at the decision-making table. For me, I had been juggling with the idea of running for office since I since I decided that this is what I wanted to do back in 2016 when Bernie Sanders was a presidential candidate, and I realized that this is what I was passionate about. But I had always talked myself out of it because I thought, for one, maybe the Bronx is not ready. The Bronx to some people is not the most progressive borough in New York City. And I was my own worst critic. I was saying to myself, well, you're a former sex worker. You are somebody who was formerly incarcerated for a very short period of time, but nevertheless formerly incarcerated for sex working. And I didn't think that folks would be ready for that. However, as I started to be more secure and more comfortable in my skin and who I am, I had this epiphany, and I said to myself, well, you know what? All of those things that you thought people were not going to support you for or connect with or relate to actually make for a really unique and compelling story. And that is actually what people will be able to relate to you for. And so when I was able to start changing the way of thinking and being more confident in telling myself, you are qualified, you can do this, you know how these things work, that's when ultimately I decided I'm throwing my name in this, and here I am.
What is it that you think that your district needs the most, and what are you most passionate about in your campaign? I think you already gave us a rationale for why you, which I think is really powerful, which is that, people who are marginalized need to be at the center of the conversation, and now decision makers. Of course, we've seen so many statistics related to COVID that the Bronx remains, sadly, the most marginalized place in New York City, and using some indicators, the most in the nation. So I'm wondering specifically, what is the thing that you want to do and focus on in your campaign and as city council member?
Well, I would say that there's two things. One would be jobs, economic justice, workforce development. This is a district where 70% of the people who live here are unemployed. This is a district where 36% of the people have less than a high school diploma. The other thing would be affordable housing. The rent in New York City is just sky high. It's too damn high, as they say. And there's 41% of people in my district who are severely rent burdened, which means that many of them are paying up to 50% of their income on their rent. And so that's unacceptable. Notwithstanding, the Bronx has lasted many things. The Bronx is the hungriest, unhealthiest borough in all of New York City. And so when you see these facts and you start to learn them, you can't just sit by idle and do nothing. You have to do something about it.
Yeah. You know, if elected, you'll be called upon, you'll have a unique role in the history of New York City and the history of New York State. I haven't quite checked this, but I would be surprised if you wouldn't be the first Latinx trans person to be elected to office in the United States. If that happens, you know, there'll be also calls beyond focusing on these local issues. Like for you, your Route 28 that Danica Roem focuses on is housing and workforce development. So beyond those aside, you'll also be asked to do things that focus on the broader issue of trans women in society. And with that in mind, I'm wondering how it strikes you that there was, of course, a trans woman murdered, Tiffany Harris, in the Bronx earlier this week, and how that strikes you. I know that she was murdered outside of your district. It wouldn't be where you would represent, but still, I'm just wondering how that strikes you, and that idea of also having a platform to speak out about these other issues.
Look, I think as one of the first trans women of color, and as you say, one of the first Latinx trans women of color to run for public office in New York City, it's incumbent upon me to speak up and speak out about these issues. You know, folks in politics will tell you that you cannot focus on your identity because you won't win. And to a certain degree, they're right. But at the same time, it's very challenging because you have to find the right balance, right? There's a lot of pressure from the community to support and speak out and use your platform to speak justice. At the same time, it feels as though you've got, you know, political consultants and stuff telling you, well, you can't speak too much to that because it's not a winning message. And so there are times when you're too trans and times when you're not trans enough. But for me personally, I'll just say that I don't run away from the fact that I'm trans. You know, I'm not running because I'm trans. I just happen to be a candidate who is trans. And I tell people all the time, do not support me simply because I'm trans. Support me because I'm a working class Latina who came from nothing, who lived in public housing and on Medicaid and food stamps. And I worked my way here to where I am. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to run as a trans candidate of color in a community where the, you know, arguably the LGBTQ movement was started by trans women of color, and they're always there to tell you, don't you forget where you came from, don't you forget who your ancestors are and the shoulders that you stand on. And I don't.
Yeah. I mean, that phrase that you use, sometimes you're too trans, sometimes you're not trans enough, I think is a really powerful one. Lastly, someone in our audience asked, and I think this is really important, they, you know, identify themselves as a trans, not trans, but a trans ally, Brian Romero. And he asked, what can people do to support trans candidates? So can you just tell us in our last question, kind of, what can people do to support you and candidates who are also trans overall?
Well, we always need financial help. One of the worst things about running for office is that you got to raise money. Otherwise, it's virtually impossible. And so for one, they could put their money where their mouth is, and they can support us, and they can donate to our campaigns. They can also use platforms like yours to amplify us and uplift us and give us the opportunity to share our message. So those are two ways I think that folks can help trans people running for office.
Yeah, and then they can do all that and tell their friends and other people that they should do the same, right? Who you are and what you're running for and why it's important for them to support you. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. I think ending on the note of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of supporting trans rights and trans candidates is a great place for us to put a pin in our conversation. I hope that we can have you back. And I know that I speak for everyone when we wish you all the best on the campaign trail, both in terms of staying safe and being able to get your message out to people in your district about who you are and why you're running.
Thank you so much, Imara.